Well, I'm known as Fred Ladd, and the appellation for that usually is the godfather or the grandfather of Astro Boy. And every time it says, "Oh yeah, you're the grandfather of Astro Boy or the father of Astro Boy," I thank you very much. And I say, that sounds kind of old. Why don't you think of me as the uncle of Astro Boy? That doesn't sound quite so old, and then I think the meaning is the same. How did Astro Boy happen for me? How did Astro Boy happen as a phenomenon? Well, Astro Boy was born in Tokyo, really in 1953, in what's called manga, the published comic book kind of things. There was a series that was being put out by a magazine publisher called Shonen, means boys magazine. And Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Tetuswan Atom, later to become our Astro Boy, Osamu Tezuka had a monthly comic strip running in the book, and he introduced this little robot character with a two-pointed hat, and the boots that are really jets. And the character caught on immediately in Japan. So the year was 1953. So the year 2003 was in fact the 50th birthday of Tetuswan Atom, our Astro Boy. Well, sometime in 1962, maybe even a bit earlier, the Fuji network in Japan saw that all its programming on Saturday morning for children consisted of taking American-made cartoons, basically, because that was the biggest volume producer in the world. Sure, there was animation coming in from other countries, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. I don't know if any studios in New Zealand at the time, but certainly there was animation facility. But not in the kind of volume that was needed to produce a series that would be enough for a network to program on a regular Saturday morning basis. So they went to Mr. Tezuka, and they said, "Look, it's nice for our kids to be watching these American-made cartoons mostly, but we think our Japanese children should be watching Japanese-made cartoons with Japanese characters. And they can be able to identify with those little Japanese characters. And we think that's a good idea. Why don't you take your little robot character and work up some adventures for television, do it in animation?" Well, he didn't have an animation studio, Tezuka didn't. He would hire himself out from time to time, and was not an animator. He was an illustrator, and an artist certainly, but not an animator. When he went into animation, he had to have an animation expert with him say, "Here's how we animate that move. So many cells, so many drawings. And to have it go this fast, we use fewer cells because you get a bigger move on each drawing. And of course, for slower action, you got to have more cells so that you have more time in between." So he was basically a comic book artist. So he took his little character of Tetuswan Atom and plotted maybe 15 or 20, I'm guessing, stories for a start to submit to the Fuji network as to how he would project to do a series of possibly as many as 200 episodes. That's a phenomenal amount by American standards. No series goes that long, because here in the United States, the pattern is to repeat, especially children's programs are repeated time after time. You might go through a cycle, a broadcaster might, and then start to repeat it. But that's not the tradition in Japan. The Fuji network, each week they would run a new adventure, no repeats. So Dr. Tezuka, he was a doctor. Osamu Tezuka began. He was actually a medical doctor who preferred to draw to the world's benefit. So he thought about it, came up with a whole proposal, and set out to do what was the pilot, called The Birth of Tetuswan Atom, The Birth of Astro Boy, which he had already done in comic book form, in manga form, but of course he would have to extrapolate the adventures far more. They're condensed for a comic book, so you've got to really plot them longer to fill an animated half hour. So The Birth of Astro Boy was done, and he introduced the cast of characters from his manga, from his comic book characters that he, introduced in print. That was the first one. There was a second one whose title escapes me for the moment. I don't recall offhand, which was episode 2. Episode number 3, however, was Expedition to Mars, where a little character, Tetuswan Atom, a little robot, takes over the command appointed by a human dignitary, a top guy of a space agency, appoints this robot to head an expedition to Mars to look for a lost astronaut. Well, back to the beginning. Birth of Astro Boy, as I say, introduced many of the characters, and because the characters would introduce themselves and you understood their interpersonal relationships, how each related to the other, that took time to introduce the characters. That didn't leave much time for action. Conversely, Expedition to Mars, that's why it sticks out in my mind, didn't have that much dialogue at all. By that time, the characters were introduced. The audience knew who they were. And so you became preoccupied with the actual trip to Mars, which was something of fascination for kids and adults too. Certainly in the early 60s when we had the race for space. Who's going to get to the moon first? Well, Birth of Astro Boy was done. At the time that it was making its debut on the Fuji network in Japan, there was a representative of NBC, the American NBC. That is a vast complex. There's an NBC network, which has stations coast to coast. So a program can be playing in New York and be seen across the country simultaneously on a cable called coaxial cable. National network. In those days, I don't think it was yet a national network. It was still regional. But that's only one division. There's also NBC Enterprises. There's NBC Films, NBC Sports, various other enterprises, ventures, business ventures, under the NBC umbrella. Well, a man from NBC Enterprises, a sales rep, was in Tokyo at about this time. That means in January of 1963. The very first, I'll jump ahead now, the very first episode of our Astro Boy, Tetuswan Atom, aired in Japan on the Fuji network, January 1, 1963. I don't know whether the NBC rep was in his room for that particular broadcast, but he was there for the next couple, certainly. And he was sitting in his hotel room, and he'd be twisting the dial on his TV set. He saw this little character, this little robot, and said, "What the heck is that?" He thought it must be an American character. The other shows were virtually all of American manufacture. And then he said, "No, there's something different about this." And he couldn't figure out what studio, if it were American, was doing this little character. He didn't know the character at all. He asked the famous ones, you know, Popeye, Betty Boop, Little Lulu, the famous characters everybody knows worldwide. But this little Tetuswan Atom, what the heck was that? And what a good dubbing job to have this little character speaking Japanese to a foreign-made cartoon, not knowing that it was done there. So he began to check it out. He made a few calls and found out that no, it was animated in Japan by a studio not too far from the hotel where he was staying. He got on the phone, he called back to New York City. He said, "Look," he said, "there's a guy back there, his name is Fred Ladd, and he's doing a series called Cartoon Classics, which he produces working for a guy who was starting up a film office in those days. It was an advertising agency that wanted a film department, and I was the head of the film department coming right out of school and going into that virtually first job." In those days here in the States, Hollywood was withholding its cartoons from television. Television was the enemy. The conventional wisdom was, why would people at home, viewers, why would they pay money to go to a box office on Saturday morning or any other time on the theater schedule to see films when they could sit at home in their living room in their undershirts if they want to, watching a black box for free? Who's going to pay money at the box office? Oh, television's the enemy. We're not going to help those TV guys get started. They withheld their cartoons. They would not release their cartoons to television, television being the enemy. So there was a dearth of cartoons. There was a lack, a poverty of fare to show to kids in Tokyo. So he thought this might be something, and he called back, as I say, to the NBC office and get a hold of Fred Ladd. He's taking animated cartoons produced abroad, not animated in the States. He's got some, among others, from Australia. He's got some from the Iron Curtain countries, looks like Yugoslav, maybe some from Russia, some from West Germany, a few from England. And he's putting them all together, intercutting them in new ways. He's making new stories by using, in fact, the animation of stock footage, weaving them together in a new form, a new title, a whole new venture. The most notable one of which was a thing called the Space Explorers. The Space Explorers, I took a 30-minute Russian cartoon some stock German footage that was actually live action called Weltraumschiff, made under the Nazi regime as propaganda. But a little model spaceship, shot in black and white, goes up a ramp, blasts off into space. Well, the little model thing looks like animation. So we took that and I tinted it blue because all the production was color. And then there was a film from Czechoslovakia made by a famous Czech director, Karl Zeman, who was a famous puppeteer and who was known for his special effects. He had made a picture called Universe, where you saw all the planets in the universe and how they rotate around the sun. So we acquired various rights to that, especially non-exclusive rights, because we were going to be intercutting it. The story was about how a young boy, a 10-year-old or 9-year-old boy, stows away aboard a spaceship that's about to launch to go out into space to look for the boy's father. And the astronaut lost in space when something goes wrong with the ship. He was headed for Mars. Something goes wrong. And so a rescue mission has to set out, and the young boy, the astronaut's son, stows away aboard ship. So they were all cut together in a new form, whole new story. And as I said, the NBC rep in Tokyo knew about this, so called a fellow named Jim Dodd in New York City at NBC Enterprises. Said, get a hold of Fred Ladd. Ask him about such and so-and-so. Simultaneously, a Japanese agent, a fellow named Fujita, Kei Fujita, went to Mushi Productions and said, look, I'm a wonderful salesman. How about letting me take your Tetuswan Atom? I think this has export possibility. And Dr. Tezuka said, oh, we're doing it for Japan. But, you know, he never considered that it might have possibilities abroad. Fujita convinced him that it might have some possibilities. He got some prints, came to New York, and one way or another, coincidentally, found his way to NBC Enterprises. He probably went to NBC Network and said, oh, we don't handle stuff like this. But NBC Enterprises might show it to them. They're in what we call syndication. They sell station by station, market by market, individual stations, not a nationwide hookup. And that's when, in fact, this fellow Jim Dodd said, gosh, it's funny you're walking in, because I had a call from our rep over in Tokyo. So call a guy named Fred Ladd. Maybe we could put the two together. Now, he probably wasn't that optimistic, because when you're buying something, you don't get enthusiastic about it. You say, well, we might have some possibility. Yeah, that gives you negotiating power. But anyhow, he expressed some interest, and he got Fujita to leave some episodes behind. There were 3, maybe 4 episodes that were left by Mr. Fujita in Jim Dodd's office in the NBC office complex. Dodd did call me one morning. It was in February of 1963. He said, look, I've heard about you. I know you do such and so-and-so. Do you have some time this afternoon or tomorrow morning possibly? Could you walk over here? My office was just a couple of blocks away. In New York City, the building right next door to Radio City Music Hall is virtually behind the NBC office structure. I'd like to show you some films. Can you come on over? I said, well, sure, why not? I think he probably had some foreign cartoons, like the Space Explorers material that I had done, and not knowing who else to call, because there weren't that many guys around doing that. So I went over, just as I say, thinking about what he could possibly have. And I thought, gosh, if they're looking to acquire children's programming, would that in fact not be competition with what we're doing over here in our own offices? Are they looking for product now? Now we're going to have to compete against them to buy animated film. When they got deep pockets, as we say, they got a fat purse, more than we have with our $1.98, so to speak. Well, he said, look, I'd like to show you a cartoon. He showed me what was episode 1, the birth of Atom, the birth of Astro, the birth of the figure we would call Astro Boy. And he showed me that, and then it was, when I came, I said, well, he said, what do you think? He said, the question is, could this be another little Pinocchio? Is that little robot? Do you think it's that little Pinocchio? That's the question. What do you think, Fred? I said, well, let me think. Could it be another little Pinocchio? I saw similarities to Pinocchio. The similarities were that the Tetuswan Atom, the little robot, was a mechanical boy, futuristic, whereas, of course, Pinocchio character was classical, hundreds of years old. But they're mechanical boys, artificial, they're not real. And that's the similarity. There's another similarity. Pinocchio is sold into a circus. And in episode 1, the robot is sold into a circus. And later on, I would learn from Tezuka himself that, yes, he was inspired, in fact, by Pinocchio. He got the idea for the character from Pinocchio. That was his updated, modern, tailor, custom-made creation. So that was going to become our Astro Boy. I'll come to that in a second. But looking at that, I thought, gee, it's a talky episode because we have a lot of characters that he's introducing here. And in addition, the difference I see through the dialogue that I can follow here with the translation, the difference is that whereas Pinocchio never knows right from wrong, that's his problem, Astro Boy always knows right from wrong. That's the difference. He's built by a scientist and programmed with artificial intelligence. So he's maybe a little bit smarter, certainly more futuristic than our Pinocchio. And that was the difference. I said, I'd like to see some more of this. So then I remember seeing episode 3, The Expedition to Mars. And I thought that was a pip of an episode because that was not all that talky, easier to dub, of course. But aside from that, the story peg, the story hook, the story line, the theme was more tweaky, more exciting, more appealing, I thought, to 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boys in particular. Some girls too, but I think it was especially a boy show. And after all, the character had premiered in print in Shonen Boys magazine for boys in Japan. So it was always considered a boys property, a boys interest thing. So Jim and I spoke a little bit, explored it, and then the question came, well, do you think you could make an English version of this? Would you like to make an English version for us? I did, of course. I became tweaked on it myself, became very much involved. We did episode number 1, and to do that, of course, once the dialogue starts, you got to have names for your characters. Well, there was a fellow at NBC, a fellow named Bill Breen, who was the head of sales. And Bill was aware, I made him aware if he wasn't aware, that I was at the time producing a feature-length animated cartoon called Pinocchio in Outer Space. It was being animated in Belgium. By the time it began actually in 1963. The animation itself began in 1960. I had written the story sometime earlier. So animation began in 1960. By 1963, the film was well underway. And we had all the adventures of Pinocchio. And I thought, about the similarities, again, about the differences. And I've always liked the Pinocchio character. I first heard about it when I was in the 3rd grade. And our 3rd grade teacher read us a book about Pinocchio. And I was tweaked on the character ever since then, which I happened to become involved in a project called Pinocchio in Outer Space, animated feature cartoon, which is being animated in Belgium because we didn't know of any facility in Japan that was in a position to take this over and take it to fruition, make a feature out of it. So the whale in Disney's Pinocchio classic, the original, is called Monstro. I was going to have a whale in space called Astro. Now the word Astro is a good name. That rang a bell over there. Bill Breen said, there's so many comic strip characters done by Stan Lee and others. Wonder Boy, Super Boy, this boy, that boy. How about Astro Boy? And that was the first time, to my knowledge, that the 2 words are put together, Astro Boy. That's where the name came from. And I'm often asked, how'd that name come about? That's how it happened. So once that happened, then it was my problem to name all the other characters that would be in the pilot. Dr. Elephant was easy because he has a big schnoz, an elephantine-like schnoz. So I call him Pachydermus J. Elephant. I always like humorous, characteristic names for the characters. There was a little fellow there with a white mustache who was very self-important. I thought he was pompous. I called him Mr. Pompous. We already have the name Astro Boy. Astro Boy's sister was easy. That would be Astro Girl. But then, how would we have the father, the name of the father figure? The father figure for Pinocchio was, of course, Geppetto. Good name in Italy. Now here in Japanese, Dr. Tezuka had named the father figure, the scientist who invents and builds the little boy robot. His name in Japanese is Dr. Tenma. Well, that's okay. He had a living boy, a real son, named Tobio. But now Tobio goes out, and he's a little reckless in his driving, and he gets killed. He's driving recklessly. The first thing I wanted to do was instead of having the boy drive recklessly and be killed that way, I always felt that it's hard for Western audiences to identify with a reckless kid. You feel, well, he gets his comeuppance if he's punished somehow. Well, you almost want to say, well, look, he deserved it. If he hadn't been so reckless and careless, this wouldn't have happened. He's only got himself to blame. Whereas if a person loses life or limb, or is put in jeopardy and is put in harm's way through circumstances beyond his control, that's different. Then they can be an innocent victim. So in my story, I have my version of the Dr. Tezuka classic. I had Tobio, the boy, out driving, and he's not driving carelessly. He's really driving very carefully. We explain in the narration. You can do this when you dub. You can change the dialogue without changing the image on the screen. And what happens is that he's driving on the highway of the future. It's the electronic highway of the future. The highway drives your car. You don't. All you do is drive onto the highway, and the highway takes over from there. Well, there's a glitch. Something goes wrong. It goes out of control. The car loses control, spins out of control, and the boy is killed. He's an innocent victim this time. So we generate sympathy for the boy. That played well with the NBC men who wanted to know what my ideas were for going to the series. That was one angle. Also, if the boy was going to be named Astro Boy, then you need to think, well, how does he derive the name Astro Boy? What's the lineage that leads to Astro Boy? So I took that name and worked backward. I had his father be Dr. Boynton. His son, Tobio in Japanese, becomes Astro Boynton III. When the live boy is killed, and the bereaved doctor, the scientist, Dr. Boynton in our version, when he wants to recreate his dead son in the form of a son who will live forever, a robot, that becomes Astro Boy. So that made sense. So we named all the characters that way, and went ahead and did the pilot. Showed it all put together to the NBC folks. Once was all mixed. Oh, by the way, let me digress for a second about the theme song. When the NBC people saw it, they saw it with an American theme song, an English theme song, which is not present in the Japanese version. They were accustomed to seeing the Japanese version, of course, and hearing the Japanese voices. But nobody spoke Japanese there, so they didn't really understand what was happening. I didn't know until I actually read the translation of what's being said, line by line, so you could really plot the action. So, the characters were now named. I had written the dialogue. The question was that whereas the Japanese version, you had a song. By song, I got to say melody. Just the melody was playing. There was an orchestral melody, da 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 da, written by a young composer in Japan named Tatsuo Takai. Tatsuo Takai had written the melody. I'm laughing because you may have known some of this from other interviews. But anyhow, this fellow Jim Dodd at NBC had a friend named Don Rockwell. And Jim called Don Rockwell and said, look, we want to have a little song made for this. Fred thinks it'd be good to have an opening song. What do you think? He said, yeah, I can do a lyric for it. And he wrote, there you go, Astro Boy, on your way into space. The lyrics passed NBC's test. Don Rockwell got a lot of kids into a studio, and they sang the song. And we used that song to open the show. So when the first print was screened for the NBC executives, they heard the opening song first, and then saw the adventure in English. Mercifully, thankfully, they thought it was fine. They thought they had a winner there. They said they thought it was good. I felt that if that was going to be the audition, that if the salespeople were going to go around showing this to station buyers across the country, that to show them an opening episode with not a lot of action, a lot of dialogue, which, kids don't want to hear dialogue, they want to hear action. They want to see action. So I remember that episode number 3, Expedition to Mars, had far less dialogue and a lot more action. So I thought that would be an idea to do show number 3 as well. I said, let's dub number 3. Let's get that recorded. And then maybe put the two episodes together. So when your salesmen go out, they go out with a longer audition, or even excerpts for one or the other, both combined. But I felt they ought to show two, the better part of 2 episodes, because the big action is always in episode number 3. So those became the first 2 episodes. Episodes 1, Birth of Astro Boy, and episode 3, Expedition to Mars. Those were shown as a pair, shown to station buyers. The very first sale was to Channel 5 in New York, WNEW-TV, New York City. And it was offered at a bargain rate, which is traditional sales tactic, to an introductory offer, to get it on the air and to try to build a record off it, try to show ratings. It rated pretty well. So that was a start. After that, it would be sold city by city. The NBC executive, the fellow I named Bill Breen, who was the head of sales, having seen the 2 episodes back to back then, episode 1, episode 3, got up after the screening was over and said, if I can't sell that, I can't sell anything. That was the beginning of Astro Boy. We would spend the summer, because the winter of 1963, as I say, we first began it in February. It came to my attention. And in April, we were already producing the English version. So that in the springtime, we were working on getting the auditions in shape to show to stations. It was sold, taken out on the road during the summer, and in the fall of 1963. Enough stations had bought it so that it was a go. It became a commercially feasible venture, and that was the beginning of the show we called Astro Boy. It would go eventually for 104 episodes. Now the first 52 episodes, which was what NBC contracted to buy, was going to be all that NBC really wanted. NBC just didn't have any history of buying anything more, any series bigger than 52. Because you'd show one a week, a station would show one a week, and then they would begin, recycling and repeating it over a 3-year term. So if a station typically would buy 3 years, a 3-year, what's called a library deal, meaning they keep these prints, these 52 prints in their library shelves over a 3-year period. They mix them up, or they program in whatever the order they like. And we also had to be careful that we didn't have any run-ons. No episode was continued. No story was continued, episode 1, episode 2. Each episode had to be complete in itself, because the syndication guys, not being national TV, but being people in a city that maybe wouldn't show the episodes in the numerical order. They would want to mix them up. So each episode had to have its own ending. We were always careful to do that. And we were working for at least a year and a half, to do those 52 episodes. When we were nearing the end of the 52 episodes, this fellow Fujita came back to NBC and said, look, now that you've got a big hit on your hands with Astro Boy, you'll undoubtedly want to, go on to, you'll want another 52. NBC said, no, we only want 52. That's all we want. I said, well, you see, the studio, Mushi Production, which was Dr. Tezuka's studio in Japan, Mushi Production, made the Astro Boy series. They were committed to the Fuji network, which never repeats any show. They were committed to make 193 minimum. Now, the NBC people hadn't known that when they went in. No one thought to discuss this. But they were assured, and in fact, the Fuji network in Japan had guaranteed what's called the completion guarantee. The Fuji network had guaranteed that if the studio, Mushi Production, if they ran out of money, if they found they had underestimated the cost, or whatever reason, they ran out of ideas, whatever, they guaranteed that 52 shows would be made and delivered to New York City, to the NBC offices. And no one at NBC thought it would go any farther. That's all they wanted. But then the agent for Mushi came in and said, well, we don't repeat in Japan, so they got to make more. We thought you were going to take them. If you're saying no, you're not going to take any more, that's a problem for the studio. We beefed up the tough to say. We beefed up the animation at your request, because the early shows had very limited animation. We didn't have much of a budget. But with NBC dollars now coming in, we could take those extra production dollars and use them to put in more animation, which is what the NBC guys wanted anyhow. So that the later episodes of Astro Boy were far more animated than the original ones, than the first early ones. Well, what was going to happen now? 193 were going to be made. NBC only wanted 52, and so the agent for Mushi said, "Well, if you're refusing to take any more, the studio has to have. We need to sell the others. So we'll offer them to the other folks out there, and maybe they'll be interested." NBC said, "Well, you can't do that. We can't be selling it, and you be selling the same series, and especially the name Astro Boy. You're not going to sell Astro Boy. That's our name." So this was a problem, and a lot of hand-wringing went on over there, how to solve the problem. Well, finally, NBC reached a compromise with the representative of Mushi. The compromise was that NBC would commit for and accept 52 more episodes for a total of 104. 104 were committed for. That became the deal, and that as part of the compromise, that then Mushi Production, knowing they had to make more episodes, still could not be able to offer them to anybody else in English. That was the compromise. That NBC would take twice as many programs as they originally had intended to take, than they wanted. They were afraid they wouldn't get their money back. They didn't think they could sell 104 episodes to any station in the USA. So the deal was made on that basis, and it worked out unexpectedly well for NBC because the shows were such a hit that indeed NBC was able to sell the second series, the second 52 as well. In Japan, the studio and the Fuji Network just said, "Okay, fine. Enough extra dollars are coming in from NBC where we can afford now to let the other 93, the remaining episodes in the series of 193 remain unsold." And the rest is history. 104 went on to this day. That's the mark you have to beat. If you want to beat Astro Boy's performance, you must exceed 104 episodes, and that's not likely to happen.